The goal of this video is to explain the concept of a phoneme. It is about what we know when we know a sound. So far, we've looked at sounds from the point of view of how we make them and how we hear them. How we make them is studied in the field of articulatory phonetics, and how we hear them is studied in the field of acoustic phonetics. Now, as we have seen, we can directly observe how sounds are made, and we can also observe the sounds themselves by translating them into sound waves. But we cannot directly observe what we know when we know a sound. Whenever we want to find out about stuff that's not directly observable, we need to create a theory. A theory provides a framework that explains some observations. Well, phonological theory is not really the same as the theory of relativity, but it is also quite abstract, as we shall see. Okay, so here is our observation. When we say pit, the P is aspirated. But when we say spit, the P is not. We can represent this observation in the form of a table, like so. What this shows us is that unaspirated P and aspirated P do not occur in the same environment. Aspirated P occurs in initial position and unaspirated P occurs following S. In linguistic terminology, we say that P and P are in complementary distribution. So that's an observation. It may not be that interesting though. Maybe you could say, it's just something about producing P and P. Maybe it's just something about how we make sounds. See, here's where we could formulate a hypothesis. Remember, we want to be explicit. So let's formulate a hypothesis based on this vague notion of something about how we make sounds. The hypothesis we could formulate is this. Unaspirated P is not possible in initial position because humans cannot articulate unaspirated P in initial position. Maybe that's just a fact about human languages. If that was the case though, then the absence of an unaspirated P in initial position would receive a phonetic explanation, something to do with the way our articulatory system works. But if we look at Austrian German, we see that this cannot be true. Austrian German falsifies our hypothesis because here unaspirated P can occur in initial position, as in Boss. In fact, there is no other way to say that because Austrian German doesn't have an aspirated version of P. There is no pos, and this is indicated by the star preceding the pos. So this would lead us to the hypothesis that humans, except for Austrians, can't say unaspirated P in word initial position. But then at the same time we have to add the hypothesis that Austrians can't say aspirated P. And that's getting kind of weird. And it gets even weirder if we look at Thai. Here, unaspirated P and aspirated P can occur in initial position. There is a word pa, meaning forest. And there is another word, pa, meaning to split. So it seems that for the pronunciation of P, there are no restrictions in Thai. So here goes our hypothesis. I think we have to give up. It simply is not a universal phonetic fact about human languages that they can't say unaspirated P in word initial position. Too bad. Though remember, part of us is happy because at least we now know more than we did before. We know that hypothesis 1 is wrong. And that's progress. So now let's get back to our observations. In English, P and P are in complementary distribution. They can't occur in the same environment. And we have added the observation that in German, aspirated P is not attested, but instead only unaspirated P is used, independent in which position. And third, in Thai, both aspirated and unaspirated P exist, and they can both occur in initial position. So let's focus on what we know and see whether we can figure out an explanation for these observations. It is actually a phonological problem. It has to do with what we know about sounds. Consider again the pattern of complementarity, like what we have in English. One way to understand complementarity is by saying that two things that are in complementary distribution, p and p, those two things are actually the same thing. Does that sound like a weird theory? Well, it shouldn't. Just think about Superman. Superman cannot occur in the same environment as Clark Kent because they are two versions of the same person. Superman and Clark Kent are in complementary distribution. Just like aspirated p and non-aspirated p are in complementary distribution. They cannot occur in the same environment because they are two versions of the same thing. Speakers of English know them as the same thing. And this is precisely what a phoneme is. And just so we have a way to distinguish actual sounds from phonemes, from things that we know about sounds, we use these angled lines to represent them. So, in English, the phoneme p has two versions, aspirated and unaspirated, and we call these two versions allophones. We here have one phoneme with two allophones. Now, in Austrian German, we have one phoneme, but only one version of it, the unaspirated p. So we call this a phone, no allo because there is no alternation. And in Thai, we have two phonemes, with one phone each. Let's formulate what we have just done as a hypothesis. To account for our observation, we have introduced a theoretical construct, the phoneme. It boils down to what we know when we know a language. And unsurprisingly, since languages differ, speakers of different languages know sounds in different ways. In English, when we know p, we know it as one phoneme, which has two allophones. In Austrian German, when we know p, we know it as one phoneme, with just one phone. And in Thai, when we know p, we actually know two phonemes. So now we have an explicit hypothesis to account for our observations. The complementarity in English is the Superman-Clark Kent effect. P and p cannot occur in the same environment because they are two different versions of the same thing, the phoneme p. In German, we simply never find an aspirated p because it's not part of the inventory of this language. The phoneme p has only one instantiation. And speakers of Thai have both p and p in their phonemic inventory. They are not the same thing, so they're not in complementary distribution. Though this leaves an open question. What happens with aspiration after S in Thai? Can you have both p and p after S? What does our hypothesis predict? And is the prediction borne out by the data? I'll leave that up to you to find out. So far, our hypothesis can account for the data. The theoretical construct, the phoneme, is useful in explaining the sound patterns of different languages. But ideally, a hypothesis should go beyond accounting for the observations. Ideally, we should find some independent evidence for the hypothesis. Let's see. If in English p and p are really two instances of the same thing, a phoneme, we predict that it shouldn't really make a difference whether we use p or p. They don't count as different phonemes. So let's see. Suppose the Austrian, who doesn't have a p as an allophone of p, comes and says bit. You will recognize it as an accent, but you will have no problem understanding pit. The absence of the aspiration doesn't alter the meaning. But now suppose that the Austrian tries to speak Thai. If our Austrian says ba, a Thai speaker will understand it as forest. But now, suppose the Austrian wants to say pa, which is Thai for split. Because the Austrian doesn't know about the aspirated b, he will still say ba. But now Thai speakers won't understand. It still sounds like the word for forest. So that's a problem. Crucially, in Thai, b and p are known as two different phonemes, two different mental representations. Therefore, they serve to distinguish between two meanings. This is a general phenomenon in Thai. Because aspirated sounds are represented as different phonemes, they count as different, and therefore they can distinguish meaning. In this case, linguists say that aspiration is a distinctive feature. In contrast, in English, aspiration does not change the meaning of a word. Aspiration is automatic in initial position. And if you leave it off, you detect an accent, but not a difference in meaning. So aspiration does not count as a distinctive feature. If, however, you replace p with k, you do get a different meaning. If you replace p with p, you don't. Now, this gives us an elegant way to define the concept of a phoneme. A phoneme is the smallest contrastive unit in the sound system of a language, where by contrastive we mean that it can distinguish meaning. And crucially, the concept of a phoneme is a theoretical construct, something that we hypothesize so we can account for our observations. Linguists have hypothesized for decades that phonemes are mental representations of sound rather than being sounds themselves. Or, as Edward Sapir said in 1933, in the physical world, the naive speaker and hearer actualize and are sensitive to sounds, but what they feel themselves to be pronouncing and hearing are phonemes. Though, in the interest of full disclosure, more recently the validity of this concept has been called into question again, though that's something that you would learn about when you actually go on to study linguistics in graduate school. For now, we can keep the concept of a morpheme, and, as I told you, it's not as complicated as the theory of relativity.